All right. Hi. Welcome to this stream on the Envoy Gateway channel. I'm Avonelle Wing with Double Exposure, and I'm here chatting with Julia Ahern with Greenbrier Games. And we're going to be talking today about solo and two-player games during the pandemic, which seems like an incredibly timely topic.
Well, I mean, in general, but yes, during the pandemic, it has definitely gotten more timely.
So before we launch into that, tell me what's up in your world, particularly over in Kickstarter land.
Right. So speaking of games that you can play solo and two-player, Lost Ones, which is a 1 to 4 player game, is live on Kickstarter. So we have been focusing all our energies on making sure that Kickstarter goes well, but also behind the scenes, making sure that we wrap up our previous Kickstarter, which was Tales of Barbaria. There was some demoing still left to do for expansions, and then of course there is also an expansion for this one. So while the core games were done, the expansions for both were in the rough drafty stage, shall we say, more than an idea and some loose leaf paper, but definitely not in the maybe we wait on it, maybe we'll do it with the, if the Kickstarter permits. So finishing those up and making sure they are not just a throw it in whatever kind of a thing. You're making sure that they're still worthy of the game before we send them to manufacturing. So that's really been behind the scenes what's going on. And then during the Kickstarter, of course, Lost Ones is our 1 to 4 player cooperative narrative, choose your own story path kind of game.
Cool. So
Thanks.
did you have Oh, I'm excited because it's beautiful and it has the range of 1 to 4 players, which means that I can play it by myself. I can drag someone else into it, and it's a co-op, which means that we aren't going to be stuck feeling fighty about competing while we're locked in pandemic.
We do both. We make both, but
yeah,
I tend to lean towards the co-op style of game, personal preference. Always have. I think I shouldn't say most, but a lot of times lends itself more to that narrative element, which is what we do and which is what I love. So it's pretty fun. I've liked it for the 3 years since it was one of those toss out a concept that I think like anybody who's in a designer does. Like you do a million of them. They're like, what if this was actually just buttons and we were collecting them to make a giant
bandolier.
Decoration. Right. Bandolier that it's going on top of a float and you need enough buttons to be the winner of the parade. Like you get ideas from your brain all the time and you think, well, that was a fun little brain exercise. Moving on with life. La 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 la. And instead this one went from, hey, what if we took this world? It's such a cool world, but we did something else with it and made it more about the storytelling. Tra-la-la-la-la. And then suddenly Gordon was like, here you go.
It's a game.
It is. Right.
So, have you done anything else in this universe, or was it just like this is the first time you've done it?
Yeah, no. So Of Dreams and Shadows, which came out in 2016, so technically it's the same universe. So it's a fantasy using a lot of archetype of a couple different Celtic legends and some Slavic. So you have a couple different fairy tale mythologies that are kind of in the same world, and it's called Otherworld. And Otherworld, and not really our world, but our world adjacent in that kind of medievally Ren Fair time that everybody likes to write fantasies in, are not side by side, I guess, more like parallel universes.
Right.
And so Of Dreams and Shadows, you're in the Four Kingdoms, which is the real world, and you are a hero pushing back these monsters that seem to be kind of invading from this other world, which is the fairy tale land.
Right.
And this one, you're kids who have been kidnapped in their sleep, most likely. So really, maybe they're sleeping and they're still in their beds and they're dreaming and having a nightmare about being it. Maybe they were taken completely, kind of like, in the Fae world, the under the hill kind of mythology, and are trying to find their way home and are not heroes at all. They're kids.
Right.
And I try to establish that it's that, but it's that kid kind of adventure. I think Stranger Things does it pretty well. I loved, when we were kids growing up, I think Goonies, even though it has problematic moments, that feeling of you're doing, like, you can as an adult see it and be like, no, don't do that. That's terrible. That's super dangerous. But as a kid, you only see the adventure part of it, or the danger, but the danger isn't real because you haven't experienced enough in life to know the danger is real, kind of a thing.
Well, and you're not genre savvy enough to know that it's not supposed to work that way.
So it's not supposed to be a horror so much as it is like an adventure where scary things do happen and sometimes bad things happen, but mostly they don't. Cool things happen. And even in the game, if you lose, you're trapped in the nightmare. You don't explicitly die. You're trapped in the nightmare, and so the nightmare restarts. So it's like a reoccurring nightmare where you keep starting at the same starting point and having the dream over until it plays out differently. So So that's
nice. So, you have
you
have the opportunity to get yourself out.
Yes, that's right.
Nice.
That is kind of, yes, that's the point of playing it, is the you win by getting home and ending the nightmare. And there are things like, as a kid, if you encounter a foe, which is one of the big bad fairy tale monsters of the universe, as opposed to the weird quirky fairy tales monsters of the universe, who may or may help you, may hurt you, but maybe a bit of both. The ones that are actually out to try to capture you, running away is a legitimate way to defeat them.
Nice.
You can defeat them by running away. So I like that. So that's this, but they're the same world of a sorts, because it's just from the other side of the coin. Of first you were in Otherworld and you were a hero and you were fighting and you were brave and it was different characters, and now you're not those characters. You've been sucked into the other world and you're learning about what is going on from a completely unaware eye. But you don't have to have played Of Dreams and Shadows, but if you have, from that storyline, you can kind of connect some dots so that it's actually a big overarching story that fills in the gaps.
That's really fun. That sounds fun.
It's
cool.
I was pretty excited when I started figuring it out. Even the box art of Dreams and Shadows was a giant clue for this one that I didn't pick up until we were playtesting it, and it happened to be on the shelf, and I happened to just, I was like trying to think of something else, and I saw it, and realized, and had this like, he had this in his brain the whole time kind of moment. So hats off to Gordon. So yeah, that's what's going on Kickstarter right now. Thanks.
Okay, so we can guess that you've played a fair amount of Lost Ones recently. What else have you played that you're really excited by?
What else have I played recently?
I mean, time is a lie, so we all understand that recent is relative.
Okay, well, recently, besides my own games, I've been play testing a lot of the new Avonelle End that's coming out, because I like a lot of deck builders, and I happen to be in a location where the people who make that game also need playtesters. So I've been playing a lot of Avonelle End 2-player version, which I actually, for most of my deck builder games, have always been, so getting back, talking about what we're talking about, tend to be 2-player games for me. I only have a handful of individuals who like it as much as I do. So that's an interesting thing, because when I get to play it with more players, I actually get frustrated at the downtime of waiting. And I actually prefer deck builders with 2 players. Yep. And it's super fast. Jennifer, who does a lot of, working at my booth and playtesting for me plays as much as I do. And we can, like, games that people are like, oh yeah, this is a 45-minute game. We're like 15, 20 tops. Set it up, put it out, pick the monster, pick the decks, and go. And like 20 minutes later, we're like, well, that was fun.
When picking a 2-player game, is that something you consider a feature? Like, is that a benefit, or are you all over the map?
So, for me, any game is worth the time as long as it doesn't overstay its welcome. I have played a game that is not a 2-player game that is a sidereal confluence of the something. It's a very long title. WizKids put it out, and it's meant to be a 9-player game. It was So going to the other side of this conversation, it was designed to be a specifically 9-player. It plays best, and I can verify this, with 9 players. It plays okay down to 7, and you can play it at 5. But it is meant to be a 5-player game, and it lasts, I don't know, 5 or 6 hours minimum.
Right.
So that game doesn't overstay its welcome with that many players, but that's such a really hard thing to accomplish. To me, if it's a 15-minute game, I'm good. If I feel like that was the game, I got it, I played it, I'll replay it probably multiple times. So setup should, at 15 minutes better be pretty much you open the box and there you are. If it's a half an hour game, and at a half an hour I feel like I had a half an hour, like, an experience during that half an hour. If it's an hour and a half and the whole time I was engaged, I don't care. I just need to know that, like, when I'm getting to the point when it ends abruptly, or if I'm sitting there for the last 20 minutes going, so snacks, we got snacks, like, that's time, and even more so now, time is meaningless. It's more, how does it feel? Am I feeling engaged the whole time? Did I feel like that was an adventure that I wanted to have, a journey with other people that came to a conclusion when it was supposed to, where either I'm vindicated because I won, or devastated because I lost, or, we're all excited because it was a weird moment that, I've had those moments playing Life, but like the Pirates of the Caribbean Life, where it's nice. Life. It's there's no, I'll whatever. I'll play Monopoly. I don't care. I'll play whatever with anybody who's excited about games. Pirates of the Caribbean Life, however, you can switch boats, but you could also sometimes switch characters. So I started off as, like, I don't know, one of the pirates, one of the non-main, like, there's so many in that cast.
Right.
And like a schooner. And I ended up in dead last points-wise, but I was Captain Jack with the Black Sparrow. And as a story arc, being dead last as Captain Jack with the with the Black Pearl, having been somebody else, just seemed exactly like it followed the movie so well that I was like, that was a beautiful experience. I never have to play this game again because I'm pretty sure it's really not that good, but it was an amazing. So yeah,
right.
It's meaningless. It's the quality of the time you have with other people and the bizarreness of the game that really matters.
So with Aeon's End, is there anything in particular about it that makes it really sparkle as a 2-person game?
Builders in general, I think, have a very distinct feel. And any 2-player, either beating this, anything that's cooperative, I think it's a challenge to balance well. And most games err on the side of making it really hard for a smaller number and more easy to defeat in a higher number. So I like the challenge in a 2-player game of a deck builder. I like that
Okay.
it's hard. I like that I don't always win.
Right.
I'm somebody who's okay with losing multiple times before getting it, and learning what the math is, what the timing is. So all of that. I like what so Will Sobel is working on this one with the team over at Indie Board and Cards. Really, I know it's not just them anymore, but they're the
Indie Game Studio.
Yeah, Indie Game Studio. But some of the things that he's doing to make this particular one innovative, because like I said, I played a lot of deck builders, from Harry Potter Battle of Hogwarts to all the Marvel Legendary, a lot of Lucky Ducks. So
Right.
the Vikings Gone Wild and Mutants, and like I've played a lot of deck builders, and this new one that they're doing, he did some very unique things that I have not seen, which was also cool, because once you get a rhythm, Dominion, like any of them, you know the dance moves. You've seen
Right.
You've been down this road before. You've seen that tree. So when you start to see somebody do something unique, that's even cool. So, but in a 2-player, I do think that it's typically slightly more challenging and stacked against you math-wise.
Right. Cool. I have played actually a fair amount of solo Castles of Mad King Ludwig this pandemic.
Really?
Because yeah.
How's
I don't know
that gone?
actually. Um, so so it's like 2-player, right? I've got 2 boards going simultaneously. And for me, the perspective of I'm looking at it this way and I'm trying to calculate all of these pieces in this direction. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I'm gonna go do something else and come back to this in half an hour. And then and like the toggling your brain in and out of the 2 modes for me is really deeply satisfying. And it means that I don't have to wait for anybody else to be in the mood to play with me. I can just like set it up and go.
I mean, that is why you make solo games and even N2-player games. So I went through a phase where, during my insomnia times, which are frequent,
Right.
I would set up 3-player Azul.
Okay.
So I had an ongoing me versus me Azul game many nights in a row for many months. And I would just be like, okay, this is happy Julie, and this is sleep deprived, lackadaisical Julie, and this is competitive, angry Julie. And then I would play them by emotion.
Okay.
I would play an
I don't know that the
abstract game.
universe is ready for this.
I would play an abstract game on emotion. Yeah, and but here's the beautiful thing. It would let me disconnect, and therefore I could go to sleep.
Yeah.
So I was so focused on the patterns and how would I perceive these patterns or this thing as this state of mind, that my brain would be like, okay, we're done. And I'd be like, oh, thank goodness. And then I would go to bed.
I've made you give up.
Yeah, it was great. So you can do it. And some people choose to do it for a variety of reasons. But I think we're starting to get better at the whole process of, why does somebody play a game by themselves?
Right.
You know,
And not just because they're lonely or pathetic, right? That's not the point.
no, it's not. And I get it. I know how that whole groundswell happened, because the whole message was board game, video games mean you're isolated, and board games bring you together, and that's why board games are good. So everybody go out there and get a board game. I get why.
Yeah.
It was a great marketing focus, and should continue to be so, because yes, board games do help you in a lot of ways work on interpersonal skills with other people, and focusing on something that is not necessarily the personal conflict that might, or your personal, like, it gives you something else to work on. And we could go talk about that forever. I love that topic. But the idea is you want to have an experience, and you want to challenge your brain and have tactile, which tabletop simulator, gotta love it, but also gotta hate it because I have to have something to mess with while I'm playing.
Yeah.
You want to challenge yourself. You want to reflect on why you're making the decisions you're making or not, and disconnect from making other decisions and take a minute to just, de-stress from life. Those are all things that sometimes you want to do or have to do without other people, because especially right now. And that shouldn't be a judged thing. But even before that, like the amount of solo board gamers and solo board gaming groups that exist on social media of people talking about their solo game experience. So they're still like being social about their independent game experience. It's not that you aren't a person who can have a conversation with other human beings and therefore must play solo. It maybe you're isolated, you're being responsible and you're in self-isolation. Maybe the people you play games with only like a certain type and you really want to play this other type and have no other outlet to do it. Maybe you just like your alone time and you're an introvert. Doesn't matter. There's a huge need, and I like that we're starting to think about it more. Without
without the stigma?
Yes.
You made the tactile grabby motions. What's your favorite? What's your current favorite, most tactile solo game? You can throw my question out if something doesn't come to mind. I just
get back to me on that.
Okay.
Get back to me on that. Because right now I've been doing a lot of Van Ryder games and they're all narrative, so I actually don't have like the bits are actually my notebook and pencil.
Tell us a little bit about those games.
Oh, so all the graphic novels, of which I have the entire 3 collections. And I love them. So it's a like graphic novel, choose your own story, RPG. And they're cool. If you haven't played them, they're just cool. So you read the first couple pages, and the first page is always a page with your stats, which you either need to photocopy because you don't want to actually write in your book, or like me, I just take a notebook and write them out and do a little sketch of my character, even though they give you the character because it's the comic book character.
Aww.
But I'm a traditionalist. I sketch my own character, and then what your stats are, and a couple pages of a set as a comic book that introduces you to what that story is, because it's not a story arc. It's lots of different individual adventures. So it could be gothic medievally times werewolf, or there's one where you're an assassin in feudal Japan. There's lots of different ones, lots of different characters, lots of different art styles, and each one, there's a Sherlock Holmes one, so each one is its own set individual adventure. So
cool. That sounds
the objectives,
really fascinating.
It is, and as you play, what you're doing is, so you're looking at just one panel in the comic book, and you're reading what's happening in the panel. But then if you find numbers, and some of them are very apparent and some of them are slightly hidden, you can jump to that panel. And that's how you're doing it. And so you're either scoring points or getting yourself killed dead and have to start back at the beginning. So you have to keep track of your stats that way. So it literally is a choose your own pathway, but through comic book panels. And then if you get enough points by the time you've resolved the story, is typically how what's your stats at the end kind of a thing. So were you an incredible vampire hunter, or did you turn into a werewolf? And maybe that's okay. Or maybe that's awesome for you because you just wanted to be a werewolf.
Right. And you had your narrative experience.
Right. So that's what those are. And those are my go-to a lot, because I can replay them because you can't keep in your head where to jump to. So that's to me a lot of not everybody in solo gaming wants this, but the vast majority of all of the conversations, surveys I've seen is that a lot of solo players want to have a feeling like they're having some sort of conversation, even if it's with the book, the experience, and that there's a narrative arc. The abstract ones don't do as well. Not that there isn't still people who want it, but it's not as big a push. Most people do want to have that kind of emotional investment of some kind, which is why I like doing narrative storytelling games that more and more I'm saying, no. We start with how would this look as a one player and then build up from there.
Right.
Especially if it's a cooperative game.
Right. So how do you scale the challenges when you're doing that? When you're thinking about one person versus a team of 4 people, how does that actually work?
A lot of changing the numbers and trial and error mostly. To be honest, there is no secret. Like, I don't have a shortcut. I wish I did. For me,
it doesn't break.
Right. For me, there's always a couple different ways you can change the numbers. In my mind, scale the math. I try to. So it's always like, so. For example, for Lost Ones, looking at the simple answer was the hand limit. You have. You can lose the game if you run out of ways to move forward. Anytime you lose, that's what. So there's multiple ways to lose the game. All of them revolve around the inability to move on from where you are. So if you run out of cards, the game is lost. Right. If the deck runs out because you've been so good at finding ways to get cards back in your hand, because it's not an automatic thing that you can do. So let's say you've been super clever and super cautious and you've done a lot of exploring, but you actually didn't go for an end game result and you just did side quest kind of things. Eventually the deck will run out. You're unable to move forward. The game is lost. Like, so there's a lot of things like that prevent, which also bake in prevent the game from overstaying its welcome.
Right.
But also, so your hand limit is 7 as a solo player, and you're not spending any time going through and saying, well, you. So it's, there is that. It's a bit of a quicker game because you're not making the choices, but also you have 7 cards. In a 4-player game, everybody has 4 cards, which, yes, that's 16 cards. However, and you can pool them together and work collaboratively if you're on the same tile, if you're in the same space. But it's 4 cards, which means any one person, if they get rid of all 4 cards, is unable to move on, and the game is lost.
Right.
So
it's got some bumpers there.
Right. So you think creatively of how everybody can still have a meaningful experience. Now, yes, you can level up, the monsters are harder, and then this scales up, and this, like, you can also do it that way where, you're more powerful as a solo player and the monsters are weaker as a solo player. But sometimes I like having I like the simplest answer whenever possible. I like the complexity to come from the exchanges of the players, not the fiddliness of the cards, which is not always what happens by any stretch of the imagination. But I like to try to go with the simplest answer, the cleanest answer first, and then build up if that isn't exciting. Because sometimes it might be simple, but it isn't fun. So trial and error.
That makes sense. So keep it simple, trial and error. Your comment about, well, you don't want to write in your book. There's a completely charming 1-person solo LARP about rediscovering magic. You're a twin and you let go of magic and your twin did not, and you've met back up, called Twain. And it is designed specifically to torture people that like one of the components that Jay, who designed it, was really excited about when we were talking this through is she made this beautiful, tactile, gorgeous book that you are expected to write in. It's amazing. It's amazing to watch people get into it and just be like, okay, I can do this. And then it happens, and it's so fun to watch.
So stressful.
So maybe not a Julie game, even though it's a Julie game.
It is. And I would still like I have really fancy notebooks. I don't have any here with me, but I have really fancy notebooks that I like will write next to it, beside it. I have tons of fancy little journals that I use. And then I keep them so that I have my notes from all the games in fancy little journals.
That's really orderly.
I gotta be me.
Yeah. So is there anything that you've played solo that really surprised you in a good way?
Good. I tend to stop playing if it surprises me in a bad way. I'm trying to think. I mean,
That's
besides,
fair.
I feel like the Gracie had thoughts. Sorry. The playing Azul is things like that are not meant to be. And that started way back at Apocalypse, where like a lot of games I play test, and especially if it has a solo play mode, I can play test it solo all the live long day, and that's great. And then so sometimes the challenge for me is getting a 4 or 5 player game to the table to play test those. And way back at the beginning, I had never thought, like, I had been playing board games my whole life, and it never occurred to me that I didn't have to follow the rule book. And if it was a 5 player game, that meant 5 people had to be playing. Like 2 people could play 2 characters each, which, because I'm a rule follower, somebody spent time writing those rules. So it didn't occur to me for the longest time. And then when it did occur to me, I'm like, no, you can't do that.
Right.
And then I realized that I had designed the game, and yes, I could. I could make an exception to my rule.
And you would
because
be okay
I wrote
if
the
someone
rule,
else did.
which seems so silly. I was in my 30s. I was a grown woman. There was no reason that I had done this for so long. But it took designing my own game to break that rule, to realize that in a solo play, if there is no good solo option in a game, that I can play it as 2 players or 3 players or as many as I needed. And of course, to start, it was playtesting. And then at some point, it evolved into me in the middle of the night playing 3 player Azul. I don't know.
I can see that narrative arc.
Thanks. Good.
I can see that progress from I had siblings who needed to play games by themselves to it's 3 a.m.
Yeah, well, and then there's that. And not just do I have siblings, but they have children who are now my built-in oftentimes. If I want to play a game, or even sometimes when I don't want to play a game, there is always a game to be played.
Right.
So that's fun. And that's an interesting thing, because playing a solo game when you have a lot of interested parties becomes a challenge to converse. Or a 2-player game when there's 3 kids and there's somebody left out. So finding that good combination where you're like, okay, well, what solo game might you want to play? Or we could play a 2-player game, and you could play a 2-player game, because like Shobu, John, who's now 10, but he was 8 when he discovered Shobu, and he loves it. He loves abstract games in general, and he can't beat me because he was 8, but he sure kept wanting to try. So we played it a lot because he was like, another game, and his siblings would be like, it's like, certainly you could find something else. Certainly the 2 of you who have been playing since you were 2 are capable. Okay, let me pull something up. Like, so that's the challenge too. When you become accustomed playing with groups, how do you switch back down? Which I think everybody's feeling right now, not just because you have siblings, but because now you can't meet up with your groups. So having that at a loss for how do you pare that down and still feel like you're having an experience, because all you know of that experience is a large group of people.
So Shobu is actually an excellent tactile 2-player. It's super, like, it feels good to play with
You've
that.
got the rope and you've got the stones, and it's so satisfying and it looks so nice, and you organize it in your brains, or at least I have. It creates order in the chaos of the universe of our lives.
And then you shove people into the river, and it's amazing.
And then you shove people, yeah. What have you.
Spellcaster from Arnar is one that I really like with kids, and it's 2-player, but I will often teach it to families where you pair up 2 kids and a parent and a kid and make teams.
Yep.
And it works really well. It's I love it because then you've got the kid brains working against the adult brains, and there's enough reading and enough like processing that they don't feel like they're being cheated of an experience or like it's being dumbed down because it's 2 of them against an adult. And I really like the fact that that scales for families. And then it's one of those that's a very quick build if you're playing 2-player as an adult against an adult. For me, it absolutely hits the doesn't overstay its welcome, is quick to set up, is satisfying. You feel like you've had an experience, you've either exhausted your opponent or you've won, and it's satisfying and it's quick.
Yep. I do think it's so. If you start with so that's the thing. That is the trick in my mind when you're designing. Start with a 1-player or 2-player versus baseline and move up. Most people don't. So anything that's like, I find so frequently the 2-player game that is a 2 to 4-player game is so matchy because they're relying on the brains of the players to add that asymmetry or that unpredictability element that makes the game which is interesting because you think about chess or you think about Yinch, or you think about Shobu, or any of those abstract games that are a match, a 1-player, and why does it make it so scaling something that is an abstract game for 2-player so challenging to scale up to a 4, or starting at a 4 scaled down to a 2 with that the math of it is that complex. So it is a difficult task, but I do think starting with a 2-player and scaling up is the more achievable, typically, goal.
Because you can always increase complexity, but it's hard to, if it starts tight, it's hard to bring it down smaller.
Correct. And I've played so many 2 to 4 players that I'm at a 2-player experience. I've played it once. I'm like, well, that's a game that I will play again sometime when there are other people.
I flummox designers every Metatopia when I'm like, how many players is your game? And they'll be like 1 to 4. And I'm like, really 1? Or like pretend 1? Really 2? Or like, are you just putting 2 on the box because that sells? And I'm really finicky about that. If it doesn't actually play 2-player, just tell me it's a 3-player game. Just tell me.
Well, it's something like Tales of Barbaria. I think it does a better job pared down to a 2-player game than the original. The original has the dice rolls, which adds the randomization, but otherwise, there's too much of that. Like if you have somebody who plays the same style as you, it's a very mirrored game.
Yeah.
I do think that because the design itself started off that way, and because foundation was the original, so spending a lot more time saying, how can you make this where the 2 players can still do things that are skewed towards and encourage them to skew towards different strategies. Once one goes one way, one goes another, was to me the solution, because there was no way to redesign a baseline game. So it was, okay, so if people play different strategies, it ends up being a different experience. How can I encourage, once one makes one choice, that it's really hard for somebody else to do the same strategy and skew them towards making a different choice, was the simplest answer. And I think did that as well. But it's a hard thing. So I like starting with okay, let's play it with 1 person. Let's play it with 2 people. is this a 1-player game? Is this a 2-player game? And I think I think everybody's doing that now. I think that's the thing to do. But it makes sense. Because yes, you will get questions for, I need a game that's for 5, 7, 9 players, but that's a very specific, my niece is having a birthday party. As opposed to, this week in our group, our gaming group, that isn't a campaign.
Right.
Steve really likes abstracts, and, Teresa's really into deck builders, and Quinn really wanted. You break up into smaller groups anyway. It happens.
So it occurs to me that the reason I was so excited by the grabby hands is that I really like very tactile games, and so my brain is like, oh, and Dimension from Cosmos. You build pyramids with spheres. You have to follow rules, and it is satisfying as a one person following the rules, and it's satisfying at 4 people following the rules. And it kind of ends up being a solo game because you can't pay attention to what other people are doing, where you then compare your scores to other people, and it is intrinsically built that you are having an experience in your own little bubble, and then you compare other people's outcomes to yours. And I really like that as a design plan, because you can actually, if you have 2 dimension sets, you've got 2 households that are playing together, you can play 5 or 6 person dimension, and it scales up just fine. And it scales back down to 1 person just fine, because you're having an experience, and no matter how many people are at the table, you're going to be engaging in that same fight against the cards and against the rules.
Yep.
So that's an interesting thing to ponder.
Well, so it serves one thing, but then it has and then people are like, but is that just playing solitaire together kind of question, which I'm okay with. I personally have no problems playing solitaire as a group. To that end, I have a much harder time with a Carcassonne. I'm building my little meadow over here world, and then you come in and put something in, not because you necessarily need it's for points for you, just to stop me from making my own happy little world kind of thing. I play it because I have to deal with those feelings and make sure that I'm not rage quitting just because somebody's decided to kick over my sand castle while I'm playing a game. And sometimes that's okay. But it's not my go-to. Game. So to your point, is it like what kind of you kind of forfeit sometimes that if that's the experience you're going for. Crusaders does that. Not the 3-dimensionals piece, but the Crusaders works and scales very well because the take thatness of it, it's you're doing a rondel, and your rondel determines, what actions and how many of them you can do at any given turn. So even though it's a take that game, it's really hard to do take that moment. So mostly you just focus on what you can do. What you can do is try to expand your kingdom in the Crusader, world, and fight the infidels, like thematically. But what I like about it is, for as many moving parts and as much as it is an area control game, it has that soothing, calming, like I'm looking at the rondel, so I'm looking at my math of the Mancala aspect of a rondel, where you pick up, this many cubes, tactile, pick up this many cubes, and I have to place one in each one, and the last one is the one that I can actually do the actions. So is that an action I want to do, and how many actions can I do, because that's the amount of cubes is what I can do. So I'm focused on that. And then when I'm looking at the map and I've got my tiny little wooden meeples that are shaped like horses and castles and stuff, and where am I placing them, that when somebody does attack me, it's almost like, okay, back to my little, and it has that same, the tactile, almost abstract energy of doing it, so that, yes, in fact, the only reason you need another player is so that you're getting, have somebody to compete against. If they had the the Mongol horde apparently overcomes by a certain point, and you have to, keep them back for a certain number of rounds, then I feel like it would be fine. You could have a solo game and still have that experience. I was going to talk about another game, but then the bits made me think of that game. And now I've lost the other one. It's gone. It's back. It's back in the ether.
So for me, one of the things that is a defining feature of a 1 or 2 person game is also that I can get it put away as quickly as I can take it out. If there are so many pieces that I'm tempted to just throw a tablecloth over it and leave it there for the next 3 years, it's not a good 2-person game for me.
That is an ongoing argument in my house.
Oh.
I like bits. I'm willing to sacrifice an amount of time to organize bits because organizing things also suits me.
That's fair.
And touching all the components makes me happy. So there's a certain level threshold I will go past of time limit that really isn't practical, that I will sacrifice because I got to play with all the bits. It's That's still fair. Like there's a certain level, which means I'm the person that always puts away all the games.
See, and I live in mortal fear of Linda opening up a game box and discovering that I was the last one to play it before her because nothing's back in its bag, and I've just gone. Yeah. And I know exactly what would happen to me if she opened that box, which is why I'm very selective.
Yeah, that's a Robert thing. Robert has been known to do that. And the hopes that we won't play that game again for months and months and months and months, which is fair. We have a lot of games, chances are. But usually I'm okay with, okay, you walk away. I've got this. Oh, the Blueprint game. It's another WizKids game with the dice that you stack. So it's the pattern top down, which is also what Reef does, but I think it does it really well. And you can play as a 2-player game. So I'm trying to remember the name of it, but it's supposed to be represented. So you have a pattern on a card, and you have to fill in that card with dice. And based on certain rule sets, so you're trying to get the most points, and you have your own set, like all of them have to be odd numbers, or you get a whole bunch of extra points if they're all 3s. But whatever you stack, as you stack up, I believe it has to start with a lower number and move to a higher number, so you can't. So at the end, you're pushing your luck to keep rolling the dice to try to get a better number from the group number or what you're bidding for against the other players. And that one works really well as a 2-player game and has that 3-dimensionality because you're hoping people won't take the dice. So there is that bit of pushing your luck about what you choose when, but then you're focused on building your own building, which is 3-dimensional in the sense that you're stacking the dice. But also there's usually several different ways to get points so that if you're stuck, like you were really hoping for that 6 to get this, but you didn't, so you can still get this many points because you used all even numbers or whatever it is type of thing.
Right.
That's one, and I'm trying to remember, I don't think it's called Blueprint, but I'm not going to find it.
Yeah, I went to try to look, and good golly, they publish a lot of games.
And it's a couple years old.
Right. So I was not going to come up with it.
Somebody will be watching this and will let us know what that game is. I'm sure.
So is there a price point for you that you would like bulk at a single or 2-player game that was specifically a single or 2-player game at, like, is it you'll spend $40, you spend $60? Or is it really just a case by case?
Because, all right, so basically one genre we haven't talked about, even though I make them, is that big box, miniature heavy, RPG style, but narrative driven game. So Yes, we make folklore, but I play a ton of those with Jennifer. Just Jennifer. Occasionally Rodney comes over and plays with us, but really it's most of the time it's Jennifer and I, and maybe we'll both play 2 characters, or maybe it's just a 2-player, depending on how we feel. So it is a 2-player game for us. And it is something that we set aside time a couple times a year because we've spent all this money on usually Kickstarter versions with all the bells and whistles. And so we will put aside time, a long weekend, an extra long weekend, about 4 times a year. And that's, our time and we will play an entire campaign, 6 stories, 5 stories, and play through the entire base of that campaign so that we feel like we've at least spent our money for some purpose besides collecting.
Right.
Now, I will spend that money and we take turns. She'll kickstart something, I'll kickstart. So we'll take turns so that it's not I'm spending all the money, but it's still a significant. We don't skimp, and they're all, a range of different publishers. But I'm sure anybody who's ever been on Kickstarter would recognize any of them. But that's with somebody else, and that's for our time. So we're not going on traveling. We're not spending it on, eating out. We're spending it on each other. And we, usually at her place. And that's our vacation that we spend.
Right.
I think that psychological, like the burnt toast psychology, I won't spend that on just myself.
Right.
Even if it's like a solo play. And so I will, I have to talk myself into getting the box sets of the fan writer because they're not cheap for, but I love them and I read all of them multiple times. So every time there's a case, but even at that, I have to work myself up into buying the full box set instead of being like, you just get one.
Aww.
I know. Like, I'm not worth it. I spend a lot of time doing stuff and working, and downtime and games are important to me and I will value them and appreciate them. But I still have that moment where I'm like, no, you don't want to spend that money on you. Which is like, who else am I spending it on? My nieces and nephews. Yeah. I'm spending it on, and my cats. That's who I'm spending it on. So that's an interesting question because I think that's a common psychological hindrance that people say, well, it's not worth it, which is not true. And it's actually probably not. For anybody out there making solo games who's frustrated when they get that comment.
Sorry.
It's not you.
It's not.
Their own value of themselves, and they are masking it by saying it's your game. It's not your game.
They have a hard time paying for other hobby stuff too.
Yeah. So that is my fun workaround is always, I'll get it for Jennifer. I'll get it for Robert. I'll get it for the kids.
I'll turn it into an adventure, an experience with other people. Yeah.
Right. But the solo gameplays, which ironically are the ones I probably spend the most time with. And so I have to have that conversation with myself. And yeah, I guess it's also a risk because when you're playing it by yourself, if you don't like it, there's nobody else to be like, well, you're enjoying it, so I guess we'll keep playing, or hey, why don't you just take it? It's just you being like, well, this is a thing I did. It is a bit of a challenge. I get it.
I actually end up the other way. Morels is actually my hands down, like my 2-player game of my heart. And I have given away more copies of Morels than combined the total number of other board games I've ever given away. I am constantly like, well, crap, I just gave away my copy. I have to order another one. Always.
Ice cool. And I guess not weirdly, but I have bought and passed on Ice Cool so many times now. It brings such joy to people, and that's, like all ages. But also, usually it's somebody new to the gaming world who's like, well, I'm like, here, let's start with this. This is a game that it doesn't matter where you're from. This is a fun thing. It's a silly thing. It's enjoyable. Let's play Icicle. And then they finish, they're like, that's amazing. I'm just like, here, just have it.
Yep.
It bring you joy. And then I go buy another one.
Yep.
And at some point, it's not going to be sold at Target anymore, and I'm going to be in trouble. So.
At some point, I really thought I had given away my last copy of Morels and that it had gone out of print, and I was genuinely distressed.
No, I got it. I got a copy. I couldn't find my copy, and it was the beginning of like quarantine, staying at home, and I was like, okay, well, and I found a copy. So it's still on Amazon, right? I hope, because I wasn't going to any stores at that point, so did buy it on Amazon. Sorry, local game stores.
We love you.
We do.
I feel like I should go and order a copy from Danny over at the Complete Strategist to Atone or something. Like, we genuinely do love you. They're a tiny publisher, and I love supporting tiny publishers.
Although, and to your point, it's harder to do, like right now, it's so hard to do that, even though it's so imperative. Because that is something that is my joy, is to walk past a small booth at a convention, the postage stamp of a booth, and be like, what you doing? Tell me about what you got.
Yep. That's actually what
Tell me about this fun thing.
I found Morels that way. I came around the corner and I'm like, why are there tiny frying pans on your table? Tell me more.
The game could have been about anything. They had me at mushrooms.
That's fair.
Yeah, no, that's a great 2-player. And like light and portable and easy to play,
and the theme and the mechanics are tightly integrated, and it doesn't overstay its welcome, and it cleans up easy. It hits all the checkpoints.
It does. I can't get somebody to play it here anymore, though. It's been because I played it a lot in the last couple months. You broke it. I never lose.
I am somehow unsurprised.
So I got to find somebody else to play with, because I mean, we both have those games. Everybody has that game that they just, and I'm always grateful that it isn't just one of my games that I play tested so many times that nobody can beat me anymore, because
Vinny and I played Scrabble until we got to the point that we were completely deadlocked, and there's never it's within 25 points at the end, and we're like, well, we're done. And I think we probably played every weekend for about 5 years, and I don't think we've played in a decade, because we just hit that point where we were so evenly matched that we were like, well, that's no fun anymore.
There's certain like, but I also get that there's a rhythm to that. There's a security in that. I can see why people would play Scrabble or Mahjong or over and over, because there's that routine. There's that. But also, I don't need to play it again. I'm good.
All right, so we're at just about 10 o'clock. Is there anything you want to put out there to tie this together, or anything that has occurred to you while we were chatting that you wanted to toss out there?
Playtime, kind of a stream of consciousness kind of thing. So no, I had no organized plan. For once, I had no organized plan for a sitting down talking about life and interviews and kind of things. I really appreciate getting to do this, though. Yay. And I would love to sit down with you in person and play a game. Again.
Soon?
Yes.
Maybe?
Yes.
Eventually. All right. So have a good night, everybody. Find Julie's Kickstarter. Back it. we're happy you joined us.
Thank you. Lost Ones on Kickstarter.